Welcome to the Business of Podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Gustav Peebles and Professor Benjamin Luzzatto as our distinguished guests on today's episode of the podcast. Before we begin the conversation, let me take a moment to introduce our guests for today's episode. To begin, I am delighted to welcome our first guest today, Dr. Gustav Peebles. Dr. Gustav Peebles is a full professor of anthropology at Stockholm University and previously spent many years at the New School in the New York City, where he served twice as an associate dean and helped design a new undergraduate program addressing key challenges in American higher education. He has led major research initiatives, including the Mellon-funded Sawyer Seminar, Currency and Empire, and is currently organizing the Venn Grain Symposium, The Price of Wealth, to connect economic and anthropology research. His publications, including The First and Last Bank with artist Professor Ben Luzzatto, and recent work examines credit, debt, money, digital currencies, including Sweden's e-currency and offshore finance. Joining us as our second guest today is Professor Benjamin Luzzatto. Professor Benjamin Luzzatto is an interdisciplinary artist and professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, whose work spans sculpture, ecology, architecture, and object design. His teaching is shaped by his writing on the philosophy of language, while his artist practice centers on close relationship with enduring natural systems and on individual agency in the face of existential threats such as the climate change. In this episode, both guests discusses their book, The First and Last Bank, Climate Change, Currency, and a New Carbon Commons, which presents a bold new approach to currency and community, one that could help remove carbon from the atmosphere and aid a powerful tool to the fight against climate change. It's our great pleasure to now invite our guests to the conversation. Dr. Gustav and Professor Benjamin, welcome to Business Talk. It's a pleasure to host you today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your book argues that currencies become fertile when people collectively believe they can harness and direct economic growth. What changes when the backing is atmospheric carbon instead of gold or debt instruments?
Yeah, thank you for that. We really dug into this book because of its potential parallels with the gold standard. So we treated the gold standard as a map, and what it did, surprisingly, and without intention, it sequestered a lot of gold in historical time quite rapidly. And so it allowed for humanity to sort of create this sort of global army of sequesterers of gold. And so what would it look like for that to be carbon? But at the same time, while we were doing the research, we were inspired by the critiques of the gold standard from people like Keynes and a famous economist at the time named Wicksell, who complained about the inefficiency and silliness of moving crates of gold around. And because gold was dead, and inert, it wasn't doing anything for society, and we should liberate ourselves from it. But Ben and I are really emphatic about the fact that carbon, unlike gold, is regenerative, not cold and dead. And so it actually has the capacity to repair the earth instead of the gold standard, which was very extractive. And in fact, the actions of the banks would be to return the carbon from where it was taken, whereas the gold standard was to remove it and put it somewhere else. So that's one major aspect of this that we're trying to tackle. But the other issue is that we actually do believe that if you look at the history of monetary theory and practice, as soon as anything has a market value, it can serve as a central reserve asset. And so carbon does have a value. It's not zero. It's not waste in that true sense of being worth $0 or even worth negative. It actually has a value, and therefore it can be operationalized and institutionalized as a reserve asset for a banking system. And in that sense, it doesn't actually deviate. So we have these sort of two answers to your question. Like on the one hand, it deviates because it repairs instead of extracts. But on the other hand, we actually think that it wouldn't have to be wildly different than the banking system that we already know so well today and all rely on. Not all of us, but many of us rely on today.
Professor Benjamin, we would like to hear from you as well.
I would add to Gustav's answer by saying that people are hungry for for a kind of ethical version of a monetary system that can be used in this fight, right? I mean, why? How come we cede the power of money when we could harness it towards this effort? And our research came together, and we, over many years, have been constructing this proposal, which I'm excited to get into in this podcast.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Dr. Gustav, you propose treating carbon not only as waste, but as something that can be drawn down into the earth by millions of users and communally owned banks. What would this look like in everyday life for a typical person or small business?
Yes, fantastic question. So the radical proposal at the heart of this is not actually that radical. We think that banks, first of all, have a dovetailing historical relationship with temples, but both banks and temples are spaces that have, throughout world history, have served as stewards of precious, valuable objects. And that we ask our banks and temples to monitor our valuables for us all the time. And so if we decide collectively, or even just a small collectivity in a local area that is excited about this proposal, were to decide that they wanted to build a collective institution called a bank that would store their carbon on their behalf, that's all that we're asking. So people on a day-to-day basis, if that were to happen, they would build this collective institution, and we think they could then the bank would have to invest in a kiln and various other assaying devices, and people would bring their carbon waste to the bank in various forms, and then it would be converted into, at least at this initial phase, right? We have this almost, like Ben likes to call it, a conceit. There's almost a conceit that you could start the banking system with biochar because it's democratically available to a wide population, and it's not a high capital outlay to get it started. But then there could be additional, as the expertise grows and as the collectivity grows, more and more people could think very creatively about other ways of bringing in carbon waste. But for starters, it would be this modality, and people would bring their carbon waste to the bank. The bank would assay how much carbon waste they had brought, and then issue them chits in their deposit account, which then could work out in the neighborhood. For example, merchants who want to advertise that they're green and dedicated to not destroying the environment could use it as a signaling device to say, if you spend your money here, you can use this currency, which we all know and we all agree is not bad for the ecology of our neighborhood. And so we actually have in the book, we have an example that was really, really close to this. They were so close already. The New York City green markets, where farmers would come from the surrounding areas to sell, or they do come on a weekly basis and sell their goods. And at those markets, they often have a collection machine, or a station rather, for gathering up people's carbon waste in New York City. And when those people would go, they would often get issued these wooden chips that they could then use at the farmers market. And so the only thing they were missing is a banking institution, right? A formalized, organized, collective banking institution. But otherwise, they were so close, right? And so we're really just asking for that. And then the bank would gradually build up this reserve asset of carbon deposited. So then it would just follow the history of the depositing institutions that we have today, which also have a very clear history of growing from very small local institutions into the gigantic ones that we have today, based on people bringing their gold and silver to the bank for safekeeping and getting issued chits in exchange for it.
Professor Benjamin, the book links digital currencies with biosequestration to make a radical intervention possible. What specific recent developments make this combination newly feasible now?
Right. Well, certainly the revolution in digital money makes exchange and accounting no longer dependent on a central authority. So there's been this kind of space in the public imagination for the kind of currency intervention that we're proposing that just wouldn't have been possible before the advent of crypto and digital money. But the other aspect of this is that there are the most sophisticated and time-tested form of sequestration has been developed by nature herself over billions and billions of years, right? Through the process of photosynthesis, right? Where atmospheric CO2 is drawn down into the body of plants. And there are also ancient fire practices where the bio waste, any kind of organic biomatter can be made stable, right? So, and this process that we refer to in the book is it's the production of biochar, right? Biochar is the new name for something that's been practiced for thousands of years all over the world, really. And this is widely available to everybody. It's relatively simple, so there are low barriers to entry. It's democratically available. There are right now, the production of biochar operates at many scales, right? So all the way down from cook stoves that are employed by billions of people every day, all the way up to large refineries. So this technology is available, it's safe, it's effective. It was listed, biochar, this kind of, and what Gustav said, this initial kind of liquid asset for the currency, because it is stable, discrete, can be quantified, distributed, and it has applications, already, like Gustav said, it has a market value already because it's carbon-based, right? Of course, it has all kinds of application, right? It can be used in the remediation of, it can be used to purify water as a very effective soil amendment, and then as an additive in manufacturing, right? And so we see this kind of network of these local carbon banks using these very available technologies to kind of bring people into the fight to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But yes, it was these democratically available interventions by everyday people that kind of made this proposal possible.
Dr. Gustav, how would a non-proprietary currency backed by sequestered carbon be issued? And what exactly counts as sequestered in your system, and who verifies it?
Right. Thank you for that. So we are insistent in the book, having really immersed ourselves in the literature on the commons and how commons management occurs, that we can't be very prescriptive about these sorts of questions. A commons is itself a living organism that has to sort of grow and be sovereign and in control of its own decision making. And so we didn't want to write a book where we laid down some sort of very firm blueprint. If you don't do it this way, it's never going to work. It's not a book like that at all. It's much more an expansive idea that people can grab hold of and then choose to deploy in specific ways, because the expertise is required to be local. There has to be local expertise about the ecology of that specific space. So we don't want to be very prescriptive, but we do at the same time agree that, of course, a successful carbon bank would need to be a net negative space. And so in that regard, we think that one of the exciting things, and we, think of it as low-hanging fruit. One of the things about this proposal is that it's actually following things that are already happening on the ground all over the place. There's millions of experts already doing this work. It follows banking, which is a well-honed and well-understood system. And so we think that in the same way as the banking system is well established, there's actually a huge number of carbon experts out in the world. There's millions of dedicated environmentalists who are already working on these things. So they would jump in to determine these questions that you're asking in any given local space. But there are, of course, verification regimes already, circulating, like Vera, for example. And if our local banks decided to join, to affirm and stamp that particular tactic as a good one, then they could use that. But the main idea is that we would be institutionalizing, by building a collective bank, we would be knitting together the dispersed ecology of experts who are already out there and activists, and they could come together in this institutional space um, to become committed and affirmed in that collective space, which is really, we think, important spur to action instead of feeling alone, doing your own part on your own. It doesn't, this is a space that people would feel a part of. But importantly, one of the ways that would happen is that our banks would be a blend of volunteer labor and remunerated labor. And so if Wall Street banks need risk managers to be paying attention to sequestrations, like how much gold is in the bank, what do our reserve assets look like, that kind of thing. Our banks would need soil scientists and ecologists to be hired who are monitoring the precise thing that you asked about.
Professors, you describe Wikipedia-style open source policies to govern the currency. What are the key rules you would encode to prioritize sustainability and equity over endless growth?
Yeah, so again, we don't want to be too prescriptive, but we do have some ideas. And one of the ideas is, for example, and this would be up to local institutions to adopt or not, but we do think it's an interesting one, which is it turns a bug of the United States 19th century monetary system into a feature. And the bug was that frustrated American policymakers at the time was that we had a bewildering array of local currencies in the United States. So each state had its own chartered banks that were issuing their own money. There's wonderful books out there about this moment in American monetary history with beautiful pictures of the old currencies that circulated. But what that did was it caused a discounting system to exist all across the United States. So a merchant who had dollars from Virginia, if they traveled to New York State, they would pay a discount rate to use their bills there because they were Virginia bills. Just like you pay a discount rate when you cross an international border today. That's more or less what was happening, but it would happen at the store or at the merchant's location, right? But that was considered frustrating because it introduced all these discounting costs, for merchants to expand at a national level. But actually, we think that a discount rate could be a really helpful and healthy indicator of a carbon footprint. So in that sense, it would internalize the externalities, right? So as the currency travels further and further away from its zone of origin, it becomes less and less valuable. So that would be one way to, combat questions of equality and destruction of the planet and its resources. But the other way is that, collective institutions in general are often spaces that help affirm, pro-social behavior instead of antisocial behavior. And so we think that, especially this is where we really rely on the argument about the dovetailing nature of temples and banks. And there are all sorts we have these examples all across the globe, all throughout world history of religious institutions, both being credit granting institutions, but also spaces where people are willingly going on a daily or at least a weekly basis to dedicate money and time to its continuance. So they put in labor and money and capital to allow this space to flourish because they believe that it's giving them something back in return. And we think that a collective commons owned bank that is dedicated to repairing the planet is the kind of thing that could help in that effort.
Professor Benjamin, because the currency is backed by sequestered carbon, you argue that using it would draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and push it into the ground. Can you walk us through listeners through the mechanism step by step?
So communities would come together, individuals and communities would come together and decide to place healthy, thriving ecologies at the center of their monetary system. And they would establish these local currencies that are backed by the sequestration. So step by step. So the idea is that, this is a collective project, right? And because of that, people, would be signaling to one another that they're all by using the currency would be signaling to one another that they are committed to this communal good, right? The growing of their local ecologies and the sequestering of carbon, which is a kind of planetary level good. And they would bring their waste, their carbon waste, to the bank in exchange for chits. And as the currency grows, it would represent more sequestration, right? Because each chit represents sequestration held in the bank. So we would want these currencies to grow over time.
Yeah. Dr. Gustav, the book compares the carbon currency trajectory to gold under the international gold standard. What parts of the historical analogy are most instructive, and where does it break down?
Whoops, I was muted there. Sorry. So great question, and I think it builds off of what Ben was just describing, which is that what was sort of, fascinating about the gold standard, but like not something that the experts who study it have particularly cared about, is that as each chit that is issued for the gold that comes into the bank, the gold becomes gradually immobilized and the chit becomes mobilized, right? So there's this interplay between the movement of something that goes driven, as we say, driven down into the ground, into a bank vault, and then the chit that circulates around it, right? And so the way in which the gold standard is a map is in precisely that way, that like we need to rapidly and at scale have a system in place for pulling carbon out of the sky and pushing it down into the earth again. So in that sense, the gold is a roadmap. It's also a roadmap because for a surprising reason, which is that people don't really know this that much about the gold standard, but there were many moments when when gold was overabundant, when there was too much gold rushing into the system. And so experts within the central banks of the time actually developed many tactics for handling the abundance of gold. I know that sounds strange, but they were worried about overissuance, which is the central thing that our banks would be worried about as well, right? And so we can follow the sterilization techniques, that's the technical language that they used, for making sure that our banks don't overissue, because everyone would think that carbon is too abundant. And finally, high quality sequestration of carbon is not necessarily abundant anyways. Carbon is abundant, but high quality sequestration of carbon is not necessarily abundant. That's something that our local banks are going to be working on and figuring out as they move forward. And then I will end on this question by saying also that one of the other reasons that the international system moved away from gold was because by the end of the gold standard, it was too scarce. And it was too volatile and too scarce. And there was too much of an international competition for this scarce resource. And so it was straitjacketing the growth of the economy. And what's nice about a carbon sequestration standard, a carbon standard instead of a gold standard, is that you could picture it properly harmonizing with the economy instead of straitjacketing it. And in that sense, local communities can, and this is a general movement within a lot of, sort of monetary theory work that's been happening for a very long time. But the idea of a money famine is there's actually a way to activate more labor and resources in a given community, and the only thing lacking is that there's too little money in the system, a money famine. Our system that we're proposing would allow communities to regulate their issuance in a way that's like harmonic with the need to issue more currency.
Professor Benjamin, if this is no silver bullet, but a complement to mitigation, where do you see it fitting alongside carbon taxes, regulation, and corporate decarbonization plans?
Right. Well, a currency, operates differently than some of these other schemes because the bank is managing the money supply, right? So if a sequestration effort fails, right, because like Gustav says, it's very difficult to start it takes 10 years to establish a regenerating ecosystem that is sequestering carbon securely, right? Um, but uh, yeah, so it is no silver bullet, but we think that because it's accessible to people, that it will has the potential to take off. Yeah, Gustav, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in and add on that too. That we're really firm about our understanding or belief, rather, that our proposal is not all or nothing. What we like about it is that anybody can start not anybody, but it is, there's legally instituted systems for starting banks in all jurisdictions all over the place. And so we're not asking for people to do this idea and then stop all the other ideas. There's so much great work happening in the climate space right now. We're not opposed. We're enthusiastic about a huge chunk of that work, and we want that energy to still be dedicated and those experts to be dedicated to what other pathways they think are the best way. So we're emphatic that it's not a silver bullet, because there's got to be, at this moment of crisis, there's got to be a bunch of different ideas. And so this is just one in the toolkit. It's not the only one by any means. And we want other grassroots and expert projects to absolutely continue. But our banks could spur the budding market in climate mitigation efforts, because, not least, our enthusiastic depositors would be hiring, so to speak, in their bank, because they co-own it. They'd be hiring experts in the green transition, and then they could choose for their loans to go to net zero, net negative projects instead of to anything else, right? So there's all these ways in which they could spur the green revolution even further and more quickly. And what we like is that, you know, you don't need to sit on the sidelines anymore. Like, you don't need to wait for a corporation to pop up with a brilliant idea that's going to suck all the carbon out of the sky. You can get started with your community right away. You don't need to wait for the government of whichever country you live in to decide that they care about the climate, when they've proven time and time again that they don't. We don't have to wait for the United Nations to come to some consensus about a global tax that's probably almost never probably going to happen, I regret to say. And so you can just get started. You can actually even have people who think you're foolish, like sitting on the side. They can be laughing at you, and you can forge ahead the same way that the person who started deposit banking in 1810 in Scotland, was considered a little bit of a kook, right? And now we have a vast and systemic deposit banking world that grew out of these local experiments. So we're excited for the possibility of people jumping in. If they're enthusiastic, they can do it. They can do it on their own. They don't need a whole lot of infrastructure. The infrastructure that they do need is already in place. The expertise that they already need is already in place, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we think, on the one hand, it's definitely not a silver bullet, but it does offer a new tool in the toolkit, and at a time when we need as many tools as we can get.
And I would also say that some of the geoengineering schemes that are now starting to be taken seriously, are potentially very dangerous, right? And threaten ecosystems worldwide. So again, by deploying everyday people all over the world, that effect is spread out, right? And so it's safer, and in our estimation, almost more realistic, really. Because it doesn't require the will of governments and whatnot.
Dr. Gustav, community-owned banks are central in your vision. What governance failures like capture, corruption, inequity worry you most? And how does the open source approach reduce those risks?
Got it. Yes, thank you for that question. So, we think that the most obvious threat to our banks, well, the funny thing is that apparently in the United States, divorce is more common than changing banks. So we are worried just about people leaving their current banks. But that's more of a fun joke. We'll be offering a very different space for people, and it follows the complementary currency movement that allows for people to not leave their other currency system, they can start and join this currency system without leaving their last one. But a bigger threat is, of course, bad loans and overissuance, just like any standard bank. But we do believe that because our banks that we propose are in the commons, that is to say, the depositors are going to own them, there's going to be an additional capacity to mitigate against that problem, because they're going to be like Hawkeye watching the management of the bank, and they themselves are going to rotate through various managerial positions, as they are so called, right? Like obviously they can't jump in and take on expert tasks that they don't have the expertise in, but there's a lot of work that they could be joining. And we think that with a more sort of Wikipedia style model, there you get the trust and transparency that typically is necessary to stop like bank runs and bank collapses. The idea is that with people being co-invested in a project, like a temple, it creates a sort of field of tension, like a spider web, right? It becomes one little chain of it can break, but the system itself stays strong. And we firmly believe that this model is, and the other reason we proposed it is that, the carbon credits market is so it's problematic to say the least at this stage. And there's a lot of people who don't trust it, right? And so we need to build up trust immediately. There's no space for failure on that front. And the only way we thought we could build up trust is for the community to actually own the bank, right? And to be monitoring it themselves, and that the sequestrations happen locally, that they can see it with their own very eyes, instead of thinking that they've bought some sequestration that's happening half a world away and they don't even know if it's actually occurring. They're going to know, they're going to care. It's a space of care that they can be committed to.
Professors, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Your approach aims to engage ordinary citizens directly in lowering atmospheric carbon. What incentives, like moral, social, or financial, do you think would most reliably drive broad adoption without reproducing inequity?
A great question to end on. Thank you for that. So the first thing we'd like to say about that is that we're so excited about this project precisely because there's a beta test out there called the Gold Standard that shows that humanity knows how to sequester at scale. So we want this project to succeed, obviously, but we also want people to understand that its primary task is to sequester carbon and not to solve endless other issues on planet Earth. And there are endless, and we recognize that. But this task is to sequester. We're not asking it to do a bunch of other things. But we do think that in the meantime, building unalienated spaces for communities to gather and institutionalize their care for their local ecology has knock-on benefits that will fight against the other issues that you're raising with your questions. And that a commons in general is, across the research on commons throughout world history, is often good at protecting against, massive wealth inequality and solving distributional problems, right? For various reasons. One is that in a commons, nobody gets to, as the language goes, enclose the primary driver of the economy, right? Whereas without a commons, somebody can enclose and copyright or patent the primary driver of the economy, and then they, of course, achieve inordinate and stunning amounts of wealth while everyone else is excluded from that space, right? And so a commons doesn't operate that way. That's very important. And I think an empirical example that's so interesting in this regard is actually Wikipedia, which, as you pointed out, we bring it up a lot in the book. But the founder of Wikipedia kept it in the commons. It's not for sale. It's not on the market. No one can come a knocking and buy Wikipedia. Well, guess what? As a result, I mean, he's doing well. Don't cry him a river. But he's not a billionaire on the order of the oligarchs that we know so well from the rest of the space of the internet. and social media. So Wikipedia is, for all of its faults, and surely it's going to go up and down, and there's going to be emergent competitors to it and what have you, but it hasn't. It is a good testimony to this operations in the commons. And actually, if you read the history of Wikipedia, it becomes very interesting in this regard, right? Like the threats to it as a functioning institution when they proposed making money off of it. For example, they started losing dedicated adherents who hived off and said, we're not going to be a part of that project. We don't want to be in a for-profit driven space. We're dedicated to the pursuit of truth. And we think Wikipedia is a brilliant way of doing that. And so then the organizers pulled back from that idea and they kept it in the commons. So there's sorts of, tensions and protections that are sort of inherently built into a commons that you don't find in a lot of other economic spaces.
Yeah,
And I would
Professor
also
Benjamin.
add, I'm sorry, I would also add that because we're placing carbon at the center of these local monetary systems, and carbon, is the stuff of life, that there will be necessarily a kind of closer relationship to local ecologies, right? And that would happen with other people in community. So that would be another kind of knockoff effect. Yes, the primary goal is to sequester carbon, but in order to do that, people have to come together and care for their local environment and value it highly.
Professors, this has been a truly insightful conversation. Your work offers a thoughtful, rigorous lens on how currency, institutions, and collective action might expand our toolkit for confronting climate change. We are grateful for the conversation, and for our listeners, you will find the book and related links in the show notes in the YouTube. Until next time, thank you for joining us. Thank you once again, Dr. Gustav and Professor Benjamin. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much. It was great. Good times. Thank you.
Thank you.